So I'm going to take the long view, and I'm going to try to do my job, which is to be critical. Number one, I think it's more sociology than psychology. I think it's less a matter of what's going on inside American heads and more a matter of there being too few American bodies in Ukraine. It's very strange to have an ally for 3 years and to send so few people physically to the country, and then when they're here to place so many restrictions on how they can move around. The result of this is that relationships between Ukrainians and Americans are far too weak, and there are far too many misunderstandings. And I end up spending a lot of my time trying to translate one to the other in a way which really shouldn't be happening at this point. Americans need to just get more mid-level Americans from the federal government and elsewhere spending more time in Ukraine. Number two...
Though with respect, Tim, there actually are many more Americans here than people realize. They're just not wearing uniforms.
They're not, with respect, David, not more than I realize.
Unless you were read on to that program, I'm not so sure. So I'm doing so my brief is to be critical. I'm sure General Petraeus is absolutely right, without any joking now, that there are plenty more than I realize. But by comparison to other wars of this scale and of this length, I think we're falling down. Number two, insofar as it is psychological, I think the big American problem is that we don't admit mistakes. And when you don't admit mistakes, it slows you down terribly because you spend a lot of time justifying what you've done before. So I think that's an American problem. And now, many Americans can stand up and admit that this is a problem, and I'll be wrong. Number three, I think there's a moral issue. That is to say, I think we spent a lot of time at the beginning of the war trying to show that we were on the right side. But sometimes, in order to be on the right side, you have to simultaneously want to win. And I do have a fair amount of personal experience trying to get the vocabulary of victory into American mouths, beginning in March of 2022, and it was very difficult. I think a lot of Americans falsely think you have to choose between doing right and winning. But sometimes in order to do right, you have to be thinking about winning, and that's been a problem for us, I think, from the very beginning. The fourth, and I know that we'll have more to say about disinfo, but the fourth problem is what I would call reflexive narcissism. So there's this concept that some of you will know very well called reflexive control. The way reflexive control works on Americans is reflexive narcissism. You try to get them to think that it's all about them. And the escalation trope, and especially nuclear war, is reflexive narcissism. It gets us to think that it's all about us, when in fact it's all about other people. It's all about Ukrainians. And then number five, to close on this, there's a conceptual issue, which is that too often, I think almost always, we start from the premise that the Ukrainians are a problem and what can we do? Whereas I think the correct premise, if you're an American or European anyway, is the Ukrainians are solving lots of our problems. How can we help them? So I think that conceptual beginning point of the conversation has also been a problem.
Well, thank you, Professor. If I was grading your essay, I'd give you an A+ for clarity of thought and analysis. And before I turn to Kaiser, I would like to go back to General Petraeus, because I'd like to ask you to respond to what Timothy just said, Professor Snyder said, and also just quickly ask, was the concern about the threat of nuclear war real, or was that just a convenient excuse?
First of all, I agree with what he said, and I also agree that there should be many more Americans on the ground. I do want the audience to understand, though, that there's a lot more out there than they realize, and that's only to be fair to the United States government and to an organization that I led when I was last in government.
So tightly on the
That's right.
Well, there's a
I
difference
do
between,
believe,
but there is a difference, with all due respect, between lots
Yeah,
of CIA spooks
I
going
didn't say
undercover
that.
and
Of course
overt Americans doing visible things.
We call it sneakers on the ground, not boots on the ground. Look, I think the concern about nuclear escalation was real. I think what reduced that concern and really alleviated it very considerably, and I hope John Herbst, former ambassador, agrees with this because he's watching this as well, was the statements by President Xi and Prime Minister Modi. Those mattered. Look, I went on CNN during that time with some encouragement, if you will, to warn in a way that folks in government couldn't necessarily say that. And, they asked me what conceptually would happen on a Sunday show. And I said, we'd destroy the Black Sea Fleet all conventionally and would destroy everything we can on the ground in Ukraine conventionally as well. I happen to know that was an option. I don't say that it would have been the option taken, but it's helpful, I think. But there was real concern at that time. There was true concern. Again, you can argue whether it was completely well-founded or not, but there was concern until, again, you have the partnership without limits between China and Russia. There have been limits, but President Xi cautions Putin publicly not to use nuclear weapons, and then Prime Minister Modi does the same thing. That is a very big deal. And I think it was a real warning to him, and I think that threat has proven to be hollow, and I think it still is hollow. It's very hard for me to conceive of anything that would lead him to use even tactical nuclear weapons, much less strategic nuclear weapons.
Okay, so there's two key points we can take away straight away, apart from